I am delighted on behalf of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions to introduce today's speaker, because this is an event that I've been looking forward to eagerly. I want to thank, though, before doing anything else, the Muslim Life Program in the Office of Religious Life here at Princeton University for co-sponsoring this afternoon's program. And I would also like to thank the MSA, the Muslim Students Association, for helping to spread the word. And it's a word very much worth spreading. What a great pleasure it is to welcome to Princeton one of the most distinguished and eminent scholars in Islamic studies in the world, and perhaps the leading defender of a robust conception of religious freedom in the Islamic intellectual world. Abdullah Saeed is the Sultan of Oman, Professor of Arab and Islamic Studies, and the Director of the National Center of Excellence for Islamic Studies at the University of Melbourne in Australia. His research focuses on one of the most important issues in Islamic thought, the negotiation of text and context, ijtihad, which we translate as reason, and interpretation. His publications cover a range of subjects on Islam and human rights, the interpretation of the Quran, the question of the relationship of the Islamic world to the West, and the reform of classical Islamic law. He's the author of many books. He has consulted regularly on contemporary Islamic issues and participates in a number of international projects. He's on the editorial board of several international refereed journals and is a member of UNESCO's Commission of Australia, the UNESCO Commission of Australia, and a board member of the Australia-Thailand Institute of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. He's very well known for his writings on religious liberty and also for his writings on interfaith relations between Islam and the other great traditions of religious faith. He received his doctorate in Islamic studies from the University of Melbourne in Australia. After the talk and the Q&A session this afternoon, we're going to have a reception just outside in honor of Professor Saeed, and we hope that you will join us for the reception. All are welcome. And with that, let me call to the microphone with great pleasure Professor Abdullah Saeed.
Thank you very much. I will just get a bit of water. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. I don't know whether you can hear me properly. Traveling from Australia to the US is not easy, so you get all sorts of problems, cold and so forth, so my voice is not as it is normally, but I'll try my best. First of all, I would like to thank James Madison Program and also Witherspoon Institute for inviting me to the US this time, and also the Muslim Life Program of the university. My topic is the case for religious freedom in Islam, or Islamic case for religious freedom. This is obviously a very big topic to deal with in one lecture. I will have to make some choices in what I have to say, and also the views and texts I select from the tradition to support my argument. Let me make 3 observations before I move into the topic. First of all, for many of us, Islam and religious freedom do not go together. They're contradiction in terms, for good reasons. When we look at the world around us, pretty much on a day-to-day basis, we hear so much about the restrictions by Muslims on Muslims as well as on non-Muslims, in the area of religious freedom. You can find examples of that in Pakistan. Recently, we had 2 assassinations of 2 very prominent figures who were questioning the blasphemy laws in Pakistan. You can hear stories from Saudi Arabia on the restrictions on Muslims and non-Muslims. In Indonesia, killing of Ahmadis, for instance, very recently. And pretty much around the Muslim world, you have plenty of stories to support the idea that Islam and religious freedom do not go together. But I would like to support the idea that Islam and religious freedom go together. Obviously, because of what is going on around the world, we may have some difficulties there. But when I look at the tradition, when I look at the history, when I look at the texts and interpretation, and when I look at the historical experiences of Muslims over the last 1400 years, I have plenty of examples, precedents, views, and ideas and practices that I could use to justify that Islam and religious freedom go together. The second observation I would like to make is when we discuss religious freedom, say in the United States, when we discuss religious freedom in the United States, most often the focus is on government restrictions on religious freedom. We don't talk about conversion from Christianity to other religions or from this religion to another. But when we talk about religious freedom in the Muslim context, quite often the focus is on conversion from Islam, apostasy, death penalty, and so forth. So there's a fair bit of difference in terms of focus. I take religious freedom as a right. I don't need to justify that. Fair bit of work has been done on that issue. I take it for granted that religious freedom is a right that we all human beings have to have and should have. My interest in this talk is very much to justify religious freedom from within the Islamic tradition. That's what I'm trying to focus on. There are philosophical arguments, theological arguments, moral arguments, and so forth that we can use to justify religious freedom as a right, as a concept. I don't need to rehearse that. So in doing what I'm doing in this lecture, I will have to make, as I said early on, some choices. Which texts I should choose, which bits of precedents I should choose. There's a choice here. It doesn't mean that is the total story. There are other stories within the tradition. Tradition, any tradition for me, is like an ocean. You can get from it whatever you want to get. But the question is, at different points in time, we emphasize different values and norms. Christianity has gone through that. Islam is going through that. Judaism has gone through that. We all go through that. There is never an end to the tradition. Tradition is always in a state of flux. And we always make choices at certain points in time as far as the kinds of things that we want to emphasize is concerned. So what do I mean by religious freedom? Well, religion, say Islam, would have certain requirements, certain emphasis, a theological emphasis that deals with questions about God, beliefs about God, and so forth, rituals, ethical and moral norms, social norms, and so forth. There is a personal dimension to that. We believe in these things. We practice those things at a personal, individual level. There is also a social dimension to that. We practice that in community. We manifest religion in community. So religion is not just about individual personal practice or beliefs. It is also very much about what we do collectively in community. My starting point in this talk is very much the universal standard we are all comfortable with. That is the standard that is given in the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are 4 very basic rights that are emphasized in this particular article or in its interpretation. The right to adopt a particular religion of one's choice, the right to change the religion, the right to manifest that religion, and also the right to be free from coercion in matters related to religion. There are, of course, other rights that are associated with that. I'm interested in these. Obviously, this is not an absolute right. There are certain restrictions. For instance, if one wants to sacrifice human beings in the name of religion, well, that is not accepted. There are other sorts of restrictions too, but I'm not going to go into that. My interest in this talk is very much about an individual's right to adopt a religion, to practice a religion, to manifest a religion, to be free from coercion from religion, by others in relation to religious matters. Of course, the group aspect is very important. The community dimension is very important because we do religious things in community. But we can leave it for the time being. Why is religious freedom so important? We don't know very many communities in history that did not have a religion of some sort. Different conceptions of religion, different conceptions of deity and so forth existed, rituals, beliefs, values, and so forth. Even today, when we look around us in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, religion is very much there, very visible. Many of us heard all sorts of views from sociologists in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, arguing that, well, by the end of the 20th century, religion probably would not have much of a place. The secularization theory taught us that modernization will lead to disappearance of religion pretty much. But what we saw at the end of the 20th century is something very different. Religion has come back with a vengeance. It's there everywhere. Religion is in all sorts of areas, in politics, in all disciplines that we can think of. Religion is very visible. It hasn't disappeared. Religion remains a very important, strong moral force for us, all of us, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others. Our legal systems, our ethical and moral systems are all very heavily influenced by religion and religious ideas. Our sense of concern for the other is also very heavily influenced by what we believe in. And of course, our identity as human beings is also very heavily influenced by our religious beliefs. So obviously, we could go on and on about the importance of religion. Restrictions on religion does lead to lots of problems at a personal and individual level. If we don't have religious freedom, imagine the kinds of problems that we would experience in a society such as the United States. If this is a Christian majority country and Muslims don't have the right to practice their religion or manifest their religion, imagine the kinds of difficulties they would have. If this is a Catholic-dominated country, imagine the rest of the Christians, what would happen to them. We can experience that in different contexts, the difficulties that if we don't have religious freedom. Societies can be destroyed, rebellions, wars, and all sorts of things in history, and even today we see a lot of that. So religious freedom is not just a theoretical idea, nice concept, a wonderful thing we can talk about. It is something that affects us as individuals, as communities, as groups. In today's multi-religious societies, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and the rest of the world, pretty much all societies are multi-religious. Without religious freedom, these societies will not be able to function properly. The benefits are many of having religious freedom: social harmony, public order, stability, lack of anxiety, and they all do have an impact on the broader community. An interesting survey was done by Hudson Institute in 2007, the Religious Freedom of the World Survey, which actually associated religious freedom with a number of important things: gender equality, low military spending, good economy, and high levels of health. Of course, religious freedom does not cause these. These wonderful things are associated with religious freedom. And there are plenty of other benefits that one can actually consider. So what is the situation with regard to religious freedom in Muslim majority countries? I'm interested in Muslim majority countries, not in minorities as such. Probably a lot of Muslim minorities function in relatively free societies where they do have religious freedom. But we do have some concerns about certain aspects of what happens in Muslim majority countries in relation to religious freedom. The picture is very mixed. At the level of the state, government, state, one can find a lot of participation of Muslim majority countries in the debate on human rights in general and religious freedom in particular. We do know that of the 57 Muslim majority countries, except a handful of them, all of them are actually or have ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which does have the Article 18 in it, which is the universal standard with which I started. But some of them have reservations on that. The point I'm trying to make is that Muslim majority countries are participating in this debate, despite the difficulties associated with the issue of conversion, change of religion, and so forth. But that picture can be rather misleading when you look at what's happening within those societies. The reality on the ground is rather mixed. There are relatively few Muslim majority countries that have a very good record on religious freedom and human rights in general. Most Muslim majority countries do not have that kind of good record as far as religious freedom is concerned. Again, one of the surveys that was done in the US here looked at a range of countries around the world, looking at the level of religious freedom these countries have. The ranked countries, they gave rankings from 1 to 7. If a country has a lower ranking, say 1 or 2 or 3, that means that country has a high degree of religious freedom. Of the 36 or so Muslim majority countries included in that survey, none of them actually got a score below 4. 1/3 of them got a score of 6 to 7, meaning a high degree of unfreedom, if you could call it that way. Any survey done by various institutes here in the US or anywhere else would show this rather difficult or not so pleasant picture as far as religious freedom is concerned. But let's not forget also that religious restrictions on religious freedom is not a particularly Muslim problem. The largest country in the world with lots of restrictions is China, which has 1.3 billion people. The world's Muslim population is roughly 1.5 billion. Well, if China and the Muslim world are together in restrictions on religious freedom, we do have a serious problem there. What are the reasons for the presence of such restrictions in Muslim majority countries? Well, there are several reasons. Let me just put before you a few of them. The very first and the most important one is the dominance of classical Islamic legal and theological positions on religious freedom. To be precise, on restrictions in relation to religious freedom for both Muslims and non-Muslims. I'll come to some details about these restrictions in a minute. But let me go through the other issues. The other issue is political situation in Muslim majority countries in general. When you look at the vast majority of Muslim countries, you will find that there is a high degree of authoritarianism in these countries. Quite often states with very little legitimacy, needing that legitimacy from the religious establishment in these countries. So you see a partnership developing between the political establishment, which does have very little legitimacy to back that up, and the religious establishment, which also needs the support of the political establishment. So they go together. The political establishment gives the power to the religious establishment, in whose interest is restrictions on religious freedom for both Muslims and non-Muslims. So it's an interesting partnership that works quite well for both the political establishment and the religious establishment in much of the Muslim majority countries. And also, let's not forget that there are quite a lot of anti-Western attitudes and rhetoric associated with these attitudes in quite a lot of Muslim majority countries. This has, of course, a historical, a history behind that. We don't have time to go into that. And there is also this idea that if we open things up, if we have more religious freedom in these societies, well-funded missionaries, in particular Christian missionaries, will come and convert these poor Muslims to Christianity and so forth. So there is a connection between the colonial history, between what is and the poverty of a lot of these Muslim majority countries and the power of the West, all actually combined to create this fear that somehow if we open things up, we would be in trouble as far as conversion is concerned. Part of my case is, in arguing for religious freedom from an Islamic point of view, is to show that pre-modern Islamic legal and theological positions on religious freedom or restrictions on religious freedom are not necessarily based on the two most important authorities in Islam. These are the Quran, which for Muslims is the very word of God. It carries that authority, God's authority. And the second most important authority in Islam is the authority of the Prophet Muhammad, who is the interpreter of God's word. If we have the kinds of restrictions I'm talking about on both Muslims and non-Muslims in the Quran as well as in the practice of the Prophet, clearly spelled out, then it would be very difficult for Muslims to say, well, God probably didn't know what he was talking about, or the Prophet didn't know what he was talking about. If that was the case, we would be in a very difficult situation. Then, of course, we have to find ways of interpreting, reinterpreting these texts. We know the story. But fortunately, when I go through the Quran, and when I go through the Prophet's practice, as far as what he did, what he said, and so forth, I don't find a lot of support for the kinds of restrictions that we have in classical Islamic legal and theological tradition as far as restrictions on both Muslims and non-Muslims are concerned. It doesn't mean that there aren't any. There are texts that can be read in various ways, but the dominant pattern for me does not support that. I'll come back to that in a minute. So you may ask, why did Muslim jurists and theologians develop these restrictions if they didn't exist in the scripture and also in the Prophet's practice? I would argue that these restrictions were developed primarily in a political context, in a political situation, particularly in the first 100 years of Muslim history. Unlike Christianity, when Islam began, it began, after a few years, of course, with this massive political power. The Prophet dies in 632. Within 100 years, Muslim political and military influence spread to Southern Europe, North Africa, Central Asia, borders of India and China. It's a huge expansion of Muslim power. This wasn't about conversion of people. We are looking at a Muslim minority ruling over a very large non-Muslim majority. Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, pagans, you name it, within the first 100 years. That political context actually pushes people who are functioning within this political environment to look at things slightly differently. So you develop certain ideas about how this power translates to the social level. What is the status of Islam? Islam is the dominant force. There may have been minority as far as numbers are concerned, but certainly they had the most power, political, military, and so forth. The elite is Muslim. So you develop certain ideas. I would say in that first 100 years, 4 key ideas developed among Muslims. One is the idea of the superiority of Islam as a religion over others. When the Prophet was alive, there was this recognition of Judaism, Christianity, Jewish scriptures and Christian scriptures and so forth. There wasn't that sense of superiority. The view was very much, these are all religions, revealed by God. The scriptures are there. You don't find a single verse in the Quran which actually says anything critical about Jewish and Christian scriptures. There are some references to some distortion of some things, but generally speaking, the Quran is very respectful of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. There is a very inclusive view of religion, prophets, revelations, teachings, God's guidance. Muhammad is not the only prophet. Muhammad is one among many. So the continuity of this tradition actually is very much there, emphasized in the Quran. So belief in the superiority of Islam emerged. It is natural for people to develop those kinds of ideas. We can find examples of that in Christian history too. So it's not just a Muslim thing. When you have this massive political power behind you, you develop these kinds of ideas. The second idea that developed in that period is the need to guard the honor of the community, Muslim community. Honor and shame, honor of the community. The third idea is preventing dishonoring of the community. And you can see some of these ideas still function even today in some Muslim societies in the context of the debates on religious freedom. The fourth idea is demonstrating the superiority of Islam in social and political life in the midst of religious diversity. This is where restrictions on other religious traditions come in. So with these 4 ideas, when jurists and theologians look at the tradition, look at the past, look at the time of the Prophet, look at the scripture, look at the practice of the Prophet, they could see plenty of things that they can use to support the idea of restrictions on religious freedom. From my point of view, all restrictions on religious freedom on Muslims as well as non-Muslims can be linked to these ideas that developed in the first century of Islam. And let's not forget also, restrictions on religious freedom existed in societies into which Muslims came in the 7th century. So it's not something Muslims are making it up. It is something that they also encountered in the societies they went into. So they also learned from the experience that the communities into which they moved in. So there's a fair bit of that also going on, learning from existing practices. And you don't have to go very far in the Middle East area, for instance, to find examples of that even in the pre-Islamic times. So when ideas of superiority and honor are translated into social and political life, you have a series of things happen. Marginalization of many Quranic ideas about religions, about human beings, about religious freedom. The Quran is very clear that individuals, people, human beings have the freedom to choose to believe or not to believe. That's what the Quran says. وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. In Arabic means whoever wants to believe, believe. Whoever doesn't want to believe, doesn't believe. That's fine. It is a choice given to us as human beings by God. And that is not just one verse. There are plenty of other verses on that, and I'll come to that in a minute. Another thing that is happening is the idea of inequality of Muslim and non-Muslim in certain areas, particularly in relation to law. Restrictions on manifestation of certain aspects of religious practice. Say for Christians, for instance, they have a church. I mean, can you have, can you ring the church bell, for instance, in the midst of a Muslim community? Is it acceptable, not acceptable? That bothers Muslims, so you shouldn't do that. If it's only in a Christian area, you can do that, but if you live in among Muslims, don't do that. Restrictions on places of worship, whether you can build new churches, renovate new churches, and so forth. Even some of these restrictions are there even today in some countries. Restrictions in inter-Muslim and non-Muslim relations, marriage, and so forth. Some of these are spelled out in the Quran too. Restrictions on Muslims in the area of conversion to another religion. Again, part of the honor of the community. You convert, you're dishonoring the community. Despite these restrictions, I would argue that in law and practice, Muslims, by and large, had a degree of tolerance as far as non-Muslims were concerned. And that tolerance was practiced pretty much right throughout Islamic history. We are not talking about full equality, equal citizenship, nothing of that sort. We are talking about a degree of tolerance. So non-Muslims can function in Muslim societies and maintain their religious traditions with some restrictions. Now, let me come to the issue of the Quran and religious freedom. The Quran is, for Muslims, the most important text, it carries the most important authority, God's authority, because from a Muslim point of view, the Quran is the very word of God. If there is a clear instruction in the Quran saying this is how you must do X, Y, Z, it will be difficult for Muslims to go against that. When you look at some of the contemporary challenges Muslims are facing today, some of the difficult issues, fortunately the Quran doesn't have a lot of those kinds of instructions, in fact very few. Of the 6,000 plus verses of the Quran, only 80 to 100, probably if you want to be really liberal in terms of what you mean by law, you could have probably a couple of hundred verses of the Quran that would have some legal implication, those kinds of very clear commandments and prohibitions. And that gives a lot of room for Muslims to function as Muslims, to develop new ideas, new institutions, and so forth as they move on. What is the Quranic position on religious freedom? What does the Quran say on religious freedom? First of all, the Quran emphasizes the dignity of the human person. In Arabic, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. This is a Quranic verse meaning, indeed, we have honored the children of Adam. It didn't say Christians, Muslims, Jews, it said children of Adam. The Quran also emphasizes the centrality of the merciful God, the one God who is merciful. It has a very inclusive view of religion. Forget about some of the ideas that developed in the post-prophetic period among Muslims. The Quran is fairly clear that it had a very inclusive view of religion. The religious traditions that it encountered in Arabia, Judaism and Christianity, the Quran has a lot to say on these religious traditions. But try to find a text that actually attacks Judaism or Christianity as religions or their scriptures. You may not find that. You may find certain ideas within Judaism and Christianity targeted and criticized very heavily. You will find also the Quran making reference to among the Jews there are those who say X, Y, Z. Among the Christians there are those who say X, Y, Z. But it doesn't actually label all Christians or all Jews in a particular way. So it did have this very inclusive view of the religion. Religion and belief is very much an individual choice. It is up to the individual to believe or not to believe. The Quran says to the Prophet, you don't have authority to force anyone to convert to your religion. You may like that, you may want that, but you don't have that authority. It is up to the individual to believe or not to believe. Your job is to teach people, communicate your message, try to convince them. If they're convinced, they will follow you. If they're not convinced, it's their right. That's what the Quran actually says. Salvation is, so before that, accountability for what one does what one say, is a very important idea in Islam. And accountability is also a personal thing, not a group thing, not a community thing. It is a personal thing. I am responsible for what I do and what I say. On the day of judgment, the belief is God is going to ask me about what I did and what I didn't do or failed to do. It is a personal thing. Salvation is also not a political issue, not a collective issue. It is a personal thing, and an ethical issue too. Forced conversions prohibited completely. And that's something that Muslims, Muslim theologians and jurists maintain right throughout history, I would say. Of course, there are always exceptions, but the general rule is that. The Quran also did not recommend any punishment, worldly punishment, for those who converted from Islam. Just look at the problems that we have in relation to this issue in much of the Muslim world. Apostasy, death penalty. What did the Quran actually say that there is a death penalty for apostasy? The Quran didn't say that. In fact, the Quran made references to apostates in one of the Quranic verses, and it made reference to the people who believe, then go back to their former beliefs, and then come back and become Muslims, and then go back to their former religions and so forth. It could have said, kill these people, but it didn't. It said simply that they will have a punishment in the hereafter. The Quran also made reference to blasphemous religious hypocrites who believed, who showed that they were Muslims, but they were not. Many references are there. But did the Quran actually say that they should be killed? No, nothing of that sort. From the Quranic point of view, it is up to the individual to believe or not to believe, to be Muslim or something else. As long as the person knows what is the true path and what is not, that's what the Quran says people should be aware of. And the result of what they do will be known on the Day of Judgment. The Quran did not see that all societies will be perfect. Members of any society, it didn't actually see the society in that way. From the Quranic point of view, in a society there will be believers, people who didn't believe, people who believe in God, people who do all sorts of awful things. That's what a society is. This idea that we find in some Muslim contexts today about perfect society is a very modern idea. It is not something the Quran was actually talking about. Some of you may object to what I just said about the Quran and say, well, what about the violence? What about the jihad? What about the fighting that the Quran actually legitimizes? My argument, my response to that is this. True, the Quran actually gave permission to Muslims to fight. And Muslims were involved in a whole range of battles and wars, etc. The first 100 years of Muslim history shows that too. But just let's look at one of the Quranic verses, in fact, the very first verse that actually gave permission to Muslims to fight. What does it say? This is what it says. Permission to fight is given to those Muslims against whom war is being wrongfully waged. Someone else is waging war against them. And most surely Allah is well able to assist them. They are those who have been expelled from their homes in defiance of what is right, for no cause, except that they say, our Lord is God. For had it not been for God's repelling some men by means of others, there would surely have been pulled down monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques in which the name of God is mentioned abundantly. What is the Quran doing here? The Quran is actually making a very close link between the permission to fight and religious freedom. Otherwise, why would the Quran actually make any mention of a church, a synagogue, or something else? It should simply say mosque. That's the verse that actually gave permission to fight. The other response I have to this is this. The Quran was very concerned about the community, call it the state, that was being established by the Prophet particularly in the last 10 years of his life in Medina. This was a place where persecuted Muslims from Mecca actually left and sought refuge in that place, in Medina. The Prophet had to flee Mecca because of persecution, and he also arrived in Medina. And this is where the first Muslim state actually began to emerge and develop. The Quran was very concerned about the security of this state. A lot of Quranic references to fighting and violence and engaging in jihad is about the stability and safety and security of this community, which was being targeted by a whole range of enemies around it. And you can see the Quranic arguments in support of that safety and stability of the state right throughout the Quran. In fact, the very last verses of the Quran to be revealed that has a very strong message for Muslims and also others, a very strong language also, is about the safety and security of the state. It wasn't about conversion. Now let's come to the Prophet. The Prophet is, of course, the second most important authority for Muslims, and what the Prophet said, what the Prophet did, what the Prophet practiced is very important for Muslims. Having said that, I must say that in any work which actually puts together traditions of the Prophet, you would have contradictory messages and so forth. As a Muslim, what I should do is to look for the dominant themes in relation to this particular issue. What I find is this: the Quran actually asks the Prophet to teach his message to the people, pagans, people of other faiths and so forth, not to force anybody to convert to Islam or to his religion. What was the attitude of the Prophet as far as other religious traditions were concerned? Let's take a few examples. When Muslims were persecuted in Mecca, that is from 610 to 10 onwards, that's the year in which the Prophet began to teach. The earliest followers of the Prophet were often from the lowest end of the society. They were persecuted heavily. And those who were reasonably well off, they were also persecuted. What did the Prophet do? He asked his followers to leave Mecca and seek protection somewhere else, just across the Red Sea in Abyssinia or modern-day Ethiopia, under a Christian ruler. The Prophet heard good things about this Christian ruler. He said, go and seek refuge there. It is only under a Christian ruler the first Muslims were able to practice their religion freely for the first time. The Prophet had good memories of that right throughout. And you can see that in his sayings and also in the Quran itself. When he came to Medina in 622, Medina had a strong Jewish community and non-Jewish community. The Prophet concluded an agreement. The agreement was about this: internal governance of the society and prevention of any external threat to the community. There was no sense of superiority or inferiority of anybody. And in fact, the document actually refers to the Jews and Muslims as an ummah, or a community. Imagine that word is being used today. That's what the Prophet used. When he went back to Mecca after 80 years in Medina with a 10,000 strong army and took over Mecca, in line with the norms at the time, he could have wiped out the entire community, but he didn't do that. His focus was not forcing people to convert or killing people. He went to the place where deities of these various tribes were placed, in the Kaaba, in the most sacred place for Muslims. He destroyed all those idols, and he brought them to the Meccans, to the public, to the square. And he said to them, what do you think I should do today? These were the people who fought with him, who persecuted him and his followers, who drove the early Muslims out of Mecca and tried their best to destroy Islam and Muslims for years and years, even after the Prophet actually came to Medina. what did he do? What did he say to them? He said, you are free to go. He didn't say you must convert. In line with the norms available at the time, the men could be killed, women and children could be enslaved. That were the norms at the time. That very act of generosity led to the conversion of the Meccans to Islam. Well, we could go on and on, but I don't have the time, so I'll cut short. Another thing I could mention is very important, that is when he actually sent his armies to various parts of Arabia, one of the instructions always was this: don't kill any person who devoted himself or herself to his or her religion. Don't touch them, whatever their religion is. Why not? Because these people are not involved in violence. They devoted themselves to their religion. He could have said, oh, kill all these people. That's not his attitude. And as far as the most problematic area for us as far in relation to religious freedom is concerned, apostates. I don't find any evidence that the Prophet actually killed people simply because they actually converted from Islam. Where that sort of killing exists, you can always interpret that as a political issue. People who are trying to destroy the community, people who are at war with the community, and so forth. Let's move very briefly to the historical evidence. When you look at the Muslim history, say from the Prophet's time to what we call Rashidun Caliphs period, Khulafa Rashidun in Arabic, immediately after the death of the Prophet, 30 years or so, then Umayyad period, Abbasid period, Ottomans, Mughals, Safavids, and so forth. Just look at the history. Just try to see the dominant picture that emerges as far as tolerance is concerned. One doesn't need to look at exceptions. There were exceptions in Muslim history, much like any other history. There were some rulers who actually misused Quranic ideas about killing or not killing. But the dominant pattern that emerges from all of these empires or caliphates, as Muslims like to call them, is that there was a high degree of tolerance of other religious traditions. The situation would vary from time to time, but that degree of tolerance was maintained right throughout the history. And we are all probably familiar with the Ottoman millet system, under which the Jewish community had their own ways of handling things, various Christian communities had their own ways of handling things, and so forth. And the same thing applies to Mughals and Safavids and others. This is very much based on Quranic ideas, prophetic ideas, and so forth. Now, the theological basis. As I mentioned early on, the Quran is very clear that human beings, all of us, men, women, people of all faiths, we are created as honored human beings, children of Adam. We all come from the same father and mother, that's the Quranic view, and we are an honored creation. Certain things are given to us: a free will, an intellect, to understand what is right and what is wrong. We have the ability to choose whichever path we want to take, right or wrong. The Quran gives us that freedom. The Quran says we showed them the two ways, right and wrong. And it's up to each individual to decide which way to go. The ethical responsibility is very much based on the idea of autonomy and agency of the human person. You can see this in Islamic theology. I don't have the time to go into the details, but there's a lot of theological writings on this issue. Having said all of that, when you look at the current situation in Muslim majority countries, and also for some Muslims who are living still in minority situations too, the weight of the classical legal and theological tradition is still very obvious. It is very dominant. When you look at some of the contemporary Muslims, theologians, jurists, political Islamists who want to establish an Islamic socio-political order, you will find that many of them arguing that we must maintain classical Islamic legal and theological positions on restrictions on religious freedom. Of course, there are other Muslims who argue against that. Let's take just one trend within Islam, within Islamic thought today, the political Islamists, who argue for establishing an Islamic socio-political order or an Islamic state. It's a 20th century phenomenon. It's a modern Islamic movement. I would say very little roots in the tradition. Let's look at it as a modern movement. If we look at a leading figure of Islamic thought, such as Maududi, for instance, Abdullah Maududi in Pakistan, when he was writing in the 1940s on the issue of Islamic State, he was conceptualizing what an Islamic State would look like. Again, it's a modern idea. We don't have a blueprint in Islamic tradition for an Islamic State. He was conceptualizing that. What would an Islamic constitution be like? What would, how would handle the citizenship issue? He could not see how Muslims and non-Muslims can be equal in an Islamic state. He could not see a role, an important role for non-Muslims in an Islamic state. He could give all sorts of freedoms to them. He even gave the freedom for them to criticize Islam, which is a bit unusual, but he said that's also perfectly okay. But he couldn't see that equality. Probably if Maududi had lived until the end of the 20th century, he may have changed his mind, much like some other political Islamists changed their mind on these issues too. People like Rashid Ghannouchi, Hassan Turabi from Sudan, these are all key figures of political Islamism. Both of them argued that we don't need to apply the punishment for apostasy, death penalty, that can go. We can consider equal citizenship for Muslims and non-Muslims in an Islamic state. There is no there should not be any differentiation. The issue of citizenship, it is not about religion, and so forth. That's just one example of the changes in contemporary Islamic thought on these issues. But what we are seeing is, despite all these difficulties with the classical legal and theological tradition, a number of Muslims are arguing for religious freedom, including some very traditionally trained Muslim scholars who are arguing for religious freedom from within the Islamic tradition and saying our Islamic tradition allows for religious freedom. We do not need to maintain classical legal and theological positions on restrictions on religious freedom. We can go back to our tradition and read the texts and interpretations and so forth in the light of social and historical and political contexts in which these interpretations developed. We can understand all of that. There is no reason why we should stay out of this debate on human rights and freedom of religion and so forth. There are a lot of positive signs in this. I see a lot of encouraging signs in relation to Muslim scholars who are trying to rethink these issues in the modern period and arguing for the adoption of the universal standard for human rights, that is the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration, or ICCPR. Despite the fact that it has the reference to the change of religion, a lot of these Muslim scholars are saying that in the modern period, there is no reason why we should maintain the death penalty for apostasy or the restrictions on non-Muslims in Muslim societies. The blasphemy trials that go on in Pakistan, for instance, the critique of that by Muslims, the killings that go on in Indonesia in relation to Ahmadis, the critique of that, and what is happening in North Africa, the critique of that, what is happening in Iraq in relation to Christians, the critique of that. We are seeing quite a bit of that debate. And one of the things that we have to remember is that when these debates, when Muslims were afraid to actually raise these issues and criticize these rules and regulations and what goes on in the name of Islam, the topic remained a taboo topic. It remained on the margins. You shouldn't touch that. You shouldn't discuss that. You shouldn't debate that. But what is happening now is Muslims are debating this particular topic of restrictions on religious freedom. It is no longer a taboo topic. Having said that, there are also also problems for those who engage with this debate, as we saw very recently in Pakistan, for instance. 2 people who were gunned down because they criticized blasphemy laws. That exists too. But what we are seeing is the emergence of a high degree of tolerance in relation to the critique of these restrictions on religious freedom emerging in Muslim societies. And I see a very big role for Muslims who are living in countries like the United States and Europe and Australia and so forth, where Muslims enjoy this high degree of religious freedom. They are able to establish their mosques. They're able to manifest their religion. There are no restrictions on the religious freedom of them. These people being promoters of the ideas of religious freedom and the benefits of religious freedom in Muslim majority contexts. And I see a huge role for them. They are experiencing religious freedom as it should be experienced from a Quranic point of view. And it is very Islamic to have that attitude. And I could go on and on, but I should shut up, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Saeed. Let's see. Let's open the floor now for discussion. Are there any students who would like to launch us in the discussion? I know that the students are preparing for their examinations, which are coming up very soon, so they may not be here in the... Yes, please. Yes, sir, please. You can, or either way. It'd be good if you'd identify yourself and direct your question to Professor Saeed.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Nazir Harb, and I'm a second-year student at the Woodrow Wilson School in the Master's Degree Program in International Relations. My question is about, first of all, thank you for coming. And my question is about, I don't know if you've heard of this situation going on in Washington State. There's a community college in a small, it's a fairly large city, Everett, that's my home state, Washington, where they have invited a speaker. I can't remember his first name. His last name is Ibrahim, but he's from a legally recognized hate group that targets Muslims and Islam. And they have paired him up with a speaker from the CARE organization. The argument that they make is that they need to provide a balanced perspective on the religion of Islam, on the Quran, and on issues pertaining to Muslim civil rights. And they have defined a balanced perspective as having someone like Mr. Ibrahim and someone from CARE. So my question is, first of all, what are your thoughts of the implications of that sort of thinking? And then also, what's the best way for people who are concerned, who believe that this is a disturbing development, to address those kinds of issues and try to correct them? Thank you.
Sorry, is the question about this idea of balance, or
that definition of balance? That we should be pairing up people who fearmonger about Islam with people who have, for people who are from organizations like CARE that represent Muslims and Islam in the United States.
Brand new to you?
No, it's brand new to me, so it's going to be very hard to make any comments about that particular case.
Is there a general question that wouldn't go to the particular facts since he is...
Yes, I mean, the general question, remains. I didn't expect many people to have heard of the case, but this idea is emerging in the United States, definitely, that a balanced presentation about the religion of Islam has to include people who are, to pick a nice word, very critical of the religion, or those who outwardly hold anti-Islamic or Islamophobic sentiment, and pairing them again with people who are practicing Muslims who don't necessarily have Islamophobic sentiments toward the religion, if that makes sense.
Thanks. I mean, this is an idea that exists in Australia too, and not just in the US, but also in Australia, and it is also an idea that is emerging in Europe. I mean, the idea is when people actually come to speak about Islam, they always present this wonderful picture of Islam. There's no problems, it's all a problem of certain Muslims, not about Islam. And another idea associated with this is there is no critique of Islamic tradition and ideas and values among Muslims. And if non-Muslims take the initiative and actually critique Islamic traditions and ideas, then they are targeted. So there is this high degree of intolerance among Muslims when it comes to criticism of Islamic things, values, norms, practices, and so forth. Now, there is some truth to that. As we know that in Europe, some people have been killed because they actually criticize certain aspects of Islamic culture or certain so-called Islamic ideas. I don't know whether they're Islamic or not, but people have been targeted. And you can see that intolerance in some Muslim societies too. If you take the example of freedom of religion and death penalty for apostasy, if in a Muslim majority country you actually have a lecture like this, a lot of Muslim majority countries may have difficulties with that. And that shows this sensitivity about critiquing the tradition is very much there. Now, my response to that is, when you present Islam to a Western audience or a Muslim audience, you don't have to be apologetic. You can look, if you are comfortable with your tradition and your identity, there is no reason why you should stand up and say, well, there are certain things that we find in Islamic history that are problematic. There are certain texts in the Quran that have been read this way or that way. There are certain aspects in the Prophet's traditions that we find that may or may not be in line with contemporary understandings about society and so forth. And one very good example is slavery, for instance. In much of Muslim history, right up to the 20th century, slavery was practiced. Should we say, well, Muslims never practiced slavery? No, Muslims did practice slavery. Awful things happened in Muslim history in relation to slavery too. But we should be able to acknowledge that. We should have the courage to say, well, these things happened in Muslim history, and we should be able also to discuss that, talk about that. Because the values and norms that may have existed in the pre-modern period don't necessarily have to be carbon copies of contemporary norms and values. A lot of things existed in Islamic tradition because that's how things were. People function in their societies, in their own values and norms and systems, ethical and moral systems. And when you're functioning in that environment, your understanding of the world and who you are, who everybody else is, actually colored by that particular context, social, historical, political, intellectual, and economic context. Things don't happen out of context. Texts are read in context. So I guess there's a valid point there. There is a high degree of intolerance among Muslims when it comes to criticism of what Muslims consider to be Islamic ideas or sometimes Muslim practices. And if these things are criticized, then whether you're a Muslim or non-Muslim, you could be targeted. I'm not saying that is the practice among all Muslims, but certainly there is a high degree of intolerance among certain sections of the Muslim communities. And my sense is also in some societies, this particular trend is becoming increasingly vocal, and they are having an undue influence on the wider Muslim discourse. They may not represent the majority, but certainly they do have a very big voice. As far as societies like this, US, and others are concerned, which have high degree of intellectual freedom, ability to discuss and debate, it is in these places these debates can happen. This is a university. This is not, a place where only one view is heard. This is a university. This is an academic setting. We should be able to present issues, not be too defensive and apologetic about Islam. There's nothing to be apologetic about. I am very comfortable as a Muslim. I'm also very comfortable in looking at my own tradition. If I'm not comfortable with my own identity as a Muslim, then I would have a lot of difficulties in standing up and say, well, these things happen, these are not particularly good, pleasant, and so forth. At the same time, I shouldn't be trying to project contemporary values and norms back to the past, which many of these critics of Islam do too, and Muslims do too.
Yes. Good. Yes, Dr. Bryson.
You mentioned fear of conversion, especially in some Muslim majority communities. I wondered if you could comment on any developments you see happening in Muslim communities, whether they're living as minorities or majorities, of a flip side to that of fear of hypocrisy and fear of spiritual anemia, which could also, positively phrased, be couched as hunger for spiritual authenticity, and thus recognition of religious freedom as being not a threat, but really something that could be helpful for Islam and Muslims.
Thank you. See, the issue of apostasy is the central issue in the discussions on religious freedom or restrictions on religious freedom among Muslims. When you look at the so-called law of apostasy, meaning that when you become a Muslim, whether you're born Muslim or converted to Islam, you don't have the right to go back to your former religion or any other religion. It's a kind of one-way ticket, as some would say, well, you become Muslim and that's it, you don't have to change, you cannot change. If you do, your head will be chopped off. It's a serious problem for religion. We have roughly 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. In terms of numbers, that's a fairly large chunk of the world's population. Why do we as Muslims need to keep people who don't want to be Muslim among ourselves, within among Muslims? Coming back to your issue, the point you raised about the issue of being a genuine Muslim or not, if you're forced to remain a Muslim, although you don't want to be Muslim, for whatever reason, because your country doesn't allow that, or if you're a citizen of a particular country, let's say the Maldives, where I come from, the constitution of this country actually says that all Maldivians must be Muslim. We know that there are Maldivians who are not Muslim. They have names like Abdullah, Muhammad, Ahmad, and so forth. And if you say, I'm not Muslim, you lose your citizenship. You lose your security. Because citizenship gives us, guarantee of security and so forth. Not quite guarantee, but security. So how do you do? What do you do in a setting like this? You show to the outside world that you're a Muslim, but you're not. You're not convinced. You may be a Christian, you may be a Buddhist, you may be something else. But the context doesn't allow you to do that. And that may well be the case in many other contexts too, where even the Constitution doesn't say that. There may be social pressure. There may not be a law in the country at all about death penalty for apostasy or anything of that sort, but the social pressure actually keeps you showing, smiling, and as a Muslim. But deep down you're not. I think it's a major spiritual problem for Islam, for other religious traditions too. I mean, apostasy existed in other religious traditions too, and when it existed, look at the impact of that on societies. You don't have to go too far. I mean, most of you're probably Christians, but you don't have to go too far in Christian history to see that, in the 14th and 15th century in Europe, for instance. It actually destroys the spiritual, dimension of the community. It creates hypocrisy. In a society where, there is one dominant religious tradition and everything has to be governed by that particular, tradition, one can understand how these ideas existed and practiced, whatever utility of those ideas was at the time. But in contemporary multi-religious plural societies, most societies are like that. There is no justification for keeping or forcing people to remain within a particular religious tradition if they don't want to be. The mobility, the spiritual mobility is quite visible to us, and physical mobility is supporting that. So my sense is the practical difficulties associated with this particular idea and conversion idea will actually lead to changes in attitudes. And the fact that we are able, as Muslims, we are able to discuss and debate these issues among Muslim societies and outside Muslim societies, and will also help. It will take time. Well, Christians have gone through these, periods of history too. It took, a long time. Maybe Muslims will have a shortcut.
I'm going to recognize Professor Philpott, and then I'm going to reserve a question to myself and then go back to the audience. Professor Philpott.
You've been making a very...
wow, you don't need it.
Thanks. I can speak more softly now. You've been making a very vigorous defense of kind of legal right to apostasy. But my question is there a correlative right to proselytism? And by proselytism, I mean, was that your question? No.
Yeah.
Well,
okay. Think of another one real quick.
Well, by proselytism, it would mean the right, and I just mean not the abusive forms, just the pure right to persuade. So say the right of a non-Muslim to seek to persuade a Muslim of the truth of this other religion and an invitation to join it. And it might seem that, the right to buy ice cream would be correlative to somebody else's right to sell it. I mean, is there a kind of implication here, or do you want to stop short and say, no, we don't want to go that far?
Thank you for the question. Again, my starting point in these matters is basically what the Quran has to say on similar issues. It's interesting the Quran asked the Prophet to communicate his message, to talk to the people, to present his ideas. And it also asked Muslims, when they speak to people of other faiths, say Christians or Jews, ask them to speak to them gently, nicely, and so forth. So the idea of communication, presenting one's message, is very much visible in the Quran. And I also go back to the idea of the individual. It is up to the individual to accept or reject this. So, see, Muslims have this concept of dawah, which is basically communicating, the message of Islam, much like Christians have also the idea of dawah. I don't see any reason why should we criminalize that activity. That is an activity that is justified in the Quran, presented to Muslims as a very valid way of discussing and talking about religious issues. The Prophet did that. He was asked to do that. Muslims were asked to do that. It shouldn't be a one-way street. It has to be both ways. I know in very many Muslim majority countries, that is a criminal offense. But much like the apostasy law, I go back to the historical development of that idea and the attitudes Muslims have developed around that. Well, some of us are Christians, some of us are Muslims, some of us are Jews and others. Well, that's something that we inherited from our parents in most cases. Most of us are probably not converts from other religions. Conversion does take place. But the idea of different religious traditions coming to the public square and discussing and debating, talking, and the Quranic idea was gently and nicely and presenting the truth, so to speak. Not violence, not fighting, not killing, but communicating and discussing. That's a very Quranic idea. I know the situation in the Muslim world, but that's something I don't actually support. I go back to the Quranic idea. And Muslims have done this for centuries. And again, if I go back to my presentation and some of the ideas that developed in relation to the superiority of Islam and honor of the community and so forth, the restrictions on proselytization is also associated with that. During the Prophet's time, we had people, all sorts of religious traditions, people arguing, people coming to the Prophet and argue against what he was teaching. Christians arguing against him, Jews arguing against him. And this is something that went on. He didn't say, well, this shouldn't happen. It is only one truth there, the truth, that as I presented. Even if it is truth from God, people still have to be convinced. So communication and dialogue must continue. And part of that is dawah, call it something else. That is a very Quranic thing. The key thing is it has to be handled gently, nicely, without violence.
Abdullah, my question relates very directly to Dr. Bryson and Professor Philpott's question, so this is turning into a rather tightly integrated conversation. it goes back to the point you made about other traditions having been through this, especially Christianity. Of course, the largest Christian tradition by far is the Catholic Church. And for most of its history, the Catholic Church rejected, often quite explicitly, the robust conception of religious freedom that you are defending. The one that includes a right to freedom from any kind of punishment, civil or at private hands, for leaving the faith, apostasy, and the right to proselytize, the right to try to talk someone out of being a Catholic. And in fact, it wasn't until 1965 at the Second Vatican Council, this is how late, in my own lifetime, that the Catholic Church went on the record embracing the robust conception of religious liberty. It did it, I think it's interesting to point out, in a document entitled Dignitatis Humanae, human dignity. And I was thinking about that precisely when you appealed to the Quranic concept of the dignity of the human person. That immediately crossed my mind as, again, the basis you're appealing to is precisely the basis that the Catholic Church appealed to in 1965. So now we have to ask ourselves the question, why did this tradition, with its very strong intellectual history of the debates between the various schools of thought in the Middle Ages and so forth, this strong philosophical tradition within the Church, why did it take so long to embrace the robust view of human dignity? Well, part of the modern story, it seems clear, is this. This was a European church. It was a universal church, yes, but also mainly a European church, shaped in large degree by the European experience, one central moment of which, very central moment of which, was the French Revolution. Now, the image of, the idea of what religious liberty was and what it entailed was shaped in the minds of Europeans and in the leadership of the church by the French Revolution, the ideology of the French Revolution, which included such notions as all religions are equally true or equally false, religious relativism or religious indifferentism, we ought not to care about religion, or the idea that religious vows did not bind because you can't bind free thought, or that religious vows are immoral to take because you're binding yourself for the future, or the complete subservience of the church to the state. And this was the image of the Catholic Church, you know, from 1789 forward, when it rejected, sometimes quite emphatically, religious liberty. What made the difference? Well, it's when these very European churchmen finally looked squarely in the face of a different tradition of what counted as religious liberty. This is America's contribution to the Catholic Church. John Courtney Murray, the famous American Catholic theologian, began to lay before the authorities of the church a vision of religious liberty that included none of those components of French revolutionary ideology or the French revolutionary idea of religious liberty. This is not something that they had even considered before. When they thought of religious liberty, they just assumed it meant this. Once the option of a different conception was on the table, it was possible for the church to embrace it. So my question, following the question of my colleagues, is, what is the image of religious liberty that is in the minds of the people who oppose you so strongly within Islam? Those who want to reject the robust conception of religious liberty, do they too see it as involving religious relativism or indifferentism or a kind of abandonment of the belief that the Islamic teaching is true? What do they have in mind? What do they think they're rejecting?
Thank you. I guess part of the answer to that is, for those who argue against the kinds of things I've been arguing for, often believe that it is so obvious that Islam, as taught by Prophet Muhammad, is the only true religion. And everything else is either false or close to that. The truth of Islam as they know it. That's one thing. The other, so if Islam is the only true religion, How can one who has been brought up as a Muslim reject it? And this should be manifestly, this should be so obvious to even, non-Muslims too. I mean, Islam is, is belief in one God and all these ideas that we have in the Quran. This should be so obvious to everyone, and everybody should convert to Islam. This idea dominates the thinking of those people who argue against the kinds of things I'm arguing for. So it's about the truth and falsity of, religions. The second thing is basically, I don't think these people are particularly interested in various Western conceptions of liberty, freedom, and so forth. These should be rejected to start with. Ideas that are coming from French Revolution or the American context, these are Western things. We should actually protect ourselves from these Western ideas. Religious freedom is a Western idea. It is coming from the West. It is pushed on us from the West. We must reject it as part of our rejection of Western ideas, Western things, in order to maintain the pristine purity of what our Islam. It is also part of the protection of the Islamic identity. We Muslims want to remain faithful to our tradition. We don't want to be entangled with various Western ideas. So the third idea associated with is, I guess, a fear. It's a fear factor. What if we move in this direction and open the space up for discourses on religious freedom, for conversion, for proselytization, and so forth? This will create chaos in our societies. Our societies, which must remain their Islamic identity, could be corrupted, destroyed, and so forth. So in order to protect the Muslim societies, we must maintain our understandings of religious freedom, which is very much their particular understanding of religious freedom. Exactly. It should be limited. Religious freedom is not this huge open thing. It is that is a very Western idea. But the problem is, as I tried to show in the talk, that idea of religious freedom conflicts with a whole range of texts, ideas, traditions, precedents of the very early period of Islam. It conflicts with Quranic conception of religious freedom, which doesn't put any kinds of restrictions on these. So when these people read the Quran and the relevant Quranic texts, do they find what I find? Their frame of reference doesn't allow them to see things that way. Because we can read any text. It's actually our frame of reference that actually helps us go in a particular direction as far as interpretation and understanding is concerned. We know that. Texts are like that. You can read a text. You can, if you're coming from a particular perspective or you have a particular frame of reference that is open to multiple interpretations, possibilities, and so forth, you can see that. But somebody else may say, well, no, there's nothing like that. Let me give you an example. One of the very famous Quranic texts is La ikraha fid din, meaning there is no coercion in religion. This is a Quranic statement. I'm not actually making it up. It's a Quranic statement. Whichever way you translate it means there is no coercion in faith or religion. The term deen Arabic can be interpreted faith or religion, or way for that matter. What is it saying? It is negating the very possibility of coercion. It's not saying don't coerce, it's saying it's negating.
It's not possible to do it.
Yeah,
so faith cannot be coerced, it's not faith.
Exactly, yes. That's what it is saying. But how did Muslim scholars actually interpret this very text? In the development of Islamic legal and theological tradition, a large majority of Muslim scholars believe that this text is abrogated. How come? Again, I go back to the context. They thought such a text must be considered on the margins of the tradition. But for me, it's a central text. There are, I would say, literally close to 100 verses I can count from the Quran to support that very idea. if you negate it, if you abrogate it, that goes against the very idea of freedom the Quran was actually talking about in relation to the human person and in relation to religion or belief that this person should accept. So it's a very narrow view of religious freedom, largely inherited from the tradition. As I said, the dominance of the tradition is very visible in much of the Muslim world. A lot of these debates we're talking about, relatively recent debates. Late 19th century, early 20th century, because of the restrictions in many Muslim societies on engaging with these kinds of debates, people didn't talk about them. Let me give you an example. I wrote a book on apostasy with someone else and published in 2004. The title of the book is Freedom of Religion, Apostasy, and Islam. I was looking at, pretty much this is a summary of what I presented is a summary of the book. This book is banned in only one country, the Maldives, where I come from. Nobody has bothered to ban it. But what's the argument for banning the book? Well, there's a political context that I won't go into that. But the argument was by discussing apostasy, the authors have become apostates. Well, we are Muslims, observant, practicing Muslims, very comfortable with our Islam, trained as traditional Muslim scholars. But just by discussing apostasy, we have become apostates. Because I'm based in Australia, my salary must be coming from CIA or somewhere else. And so it's an agent of the West trying to destroy Islam. Those are the kinds of arguments used to ban the book. Of course, there are others too, but I was summarizing. That's in summary what this is all about.
Thank you. Yes, up here. Yeah, you're in the green shirt.
Okay. Thank you. This is a guy who sounds like he agreed with you.
You're speaking pretty loud as well.
Yeah, I was also a professor. Yeah.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Arch Davis. I'm an alum of the graduate school here. It sounds like he agrees with it. He said the choice is between Islam and blasphemy, and the man must decide. That's a quote from late Ayatollah Khomeini, and the man he was speaking about was Saddam Hussein, who sounds like he doubted that he was being a serious Muslim. Now, I have a late friend who sadly died young, named Najib, whose grandfather was governor of northern Afghanistan. Very devout Muslim, very dear friend of mine as well. And he would come back, he would say, in Afghanistan there are many, many Islamics. There are many Islamics, but not many Muslims, less than 1%. So it was a spiritual thing. I think he certainly defined himself as a Muslim, not just an Islamic part of the Ummah. Yeah.
Thank you. The idea that if I get you correctly, it's you're talking about Islam. There are plenty of Muslims, but not much of Islam. Is it?
So that sort of brings up the idea. I mean, there's a societal thing. Everybody says they're
Muslim,
but they don't know what they're talking about. They have no spirituality, and so forth. So in a way, it gets back to what we're saying about whether you're really a Muslim or freedom, or you have that freedom.
Sure. Yep. When you look at Muslim societies around the world, you still find quite a lot of literacy problems. People, are Muslim because they were born to Muslim families, but many of them don't know what Islam is, Islamic tradition is, and so forth. There are, of course, Muslims who have studied this and understand that. I'll just give you a very brief example from the late 19th century. An Egyptian, very famous figure, went to France and spent some time there and went back to Egypt. And when he went back to Egypt, his colleagues asked him, well, you spent all this time in France. Wasn't it difficult for you to live in France? You don't have very many Muslims. He said something very interesting. He said, I didn't find many Muslims, but I found a lot of Islam there. That actually summarizes that. Basically, a lot of Islamic values and norms and so forth, but not many Muslims. Similar thing could be said about the US. You come here, spend time here, you see a lot of Islamic ideas, values, and norms, but it's not a Muslim country as such. And of course, you can say, well, Christian and ethical, Muslim ethical and moral norms are very similar. But that's not the issue. The issue is there are plenty of Muslims, but without an understanding of Islam.
Professor Mooney?
Yes, hi. I'm Margarita Mooney, a professor of sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You said both at the beginning and at the end of your talk that the classical theological tradition in Islam is very heavy in favor of restricting religious freedom. Yet you, as a scholar of Islam, want to emphasize Quranic texts that would be in support of religious freedom, and you talk a lot about communication and dialogue. So my question is, given that, if, as you're saying, centuries of tradition have been against religious freedom, for you to argue that there is a chance for Islam to embrace religious freedom, does not there also have to be some sort of a concept that revelation or tradition itself can develop a new doctrine? And I'm wondering if there's some precedent from within Islam that you could point to that would illustrate that, in fact, Islamic doctrine can change, the voice of God can still be heard, because if not, I see the weight of this tradition being, more the issue being not that you can't have a development of tradition. This is what it's been for 1,800 years, therefore we will not change. So is there some precedent of another theological concept within Islam that has developed or changed that could open up this dialogue?
Thank you. A very important concept in Islamic tradition is the concept of tajdeed, means renewal. It's a very important concept in both Islamic law and theology. The idea is the texts are fixed. You have the Quran as a fixed text. You have the traditions of the Prophet. Texts are fixed. But texts require interpretation, as we all know. And at different points in time, there will be renewers, or mujaddid as referred to in Arabic. They will come and renew the faith and tradition for Muslims, dealing with contemporary challenges, issues, and so forth. And Islamic tradition recognizes that these people have come. People like Ghazali, for instance, very famous in the 12th century. Sirhandi in India, Shah Waliullah, you can name a whole range of these people coming and renewing the faith. Of course, renewing the faith also understood differently in different contexts in Islamic tradition. But this very central concept actually plays that part. At the end of the day, we don't have, like the Catholic Church, for instance, the figure of Pope, for instance, within Catholic tradition, which gives a certain degree of stability for a long period of time on matters of doctrine and so forth. Among Muslims, what do we have? We don't have such a central institution. As Muslim scholars, as individuals, we engage with the tradition, we engage with the text, we engage with interpretation. What I'm doing is actually engaging in the traditional interpretation. At the end of the day, what would happen to my views or similar views? It would depend on the degree of acceptability by the broader community. The concept of ijma, the consensus, is an important concept. It is something that emerges out of the debates and discussions which may go on for centuries or decades or years. And once that consensus emerges, that becomes authoritative. We are still functioning within the tradition, but it sometimes what I might be presenting may not be necessarily in line what certain aspects of classical tradition might be presenting. That's not the issue. The issue is at a particular point in time and context, what ideas become acceptable broadly. Religious, maybe in 20, 30 years' time, we may not even have these debates. I'm optimistic. But, I'm sure it wouldn't take hundreds of years, because this debate is becoming a very much a Muslim debate too. When you are oppressed as a Muslim or non-Muslim, it affects you. It affects who actually live with you or who is around you. And this is now circulated to the world around us. It becomes a global issue. There is a focus on religious freedom. Everybody knows that the standard is the Article 18. Otherwise, why would Muslim governments actually put all sorts of excuses for their restrictions on religious freedom? That's the standard. We are trying to sort of reach that. Maybe we haven't gone that far. My sense is the tradition has ability internally to renew itself. There are important concepts in it. Thank you.
This Margarita, suggests the question of whether there's some parallel with Newman's idea of a development of doctrine within Islam. Gosh, this is such a fascinating and illuminating discussion. I wish we could go on for 2 more hours and hold you despite your jet lag. But we only have time for one more question. So please, Professor, you could have your question.
My name is Ali Chaudhry. I'm a professor in the School of Business at Rutgers University. I'm a friend of Sohaib Sultan, whom I thank for keeping me informed about these events. So I'm here today. I appreciated your presentation very much. My question goes to blasphemy. I happened to be in Pakistan a few days after Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab, was killed. And I was talking to a lawyer friend of mine who practices before the Supreme Court of Punjab, and the Supreme Court of Pakistan even. And I asked him this question. I said, how can you, there are 300 lawyers who are willing to defend this man who gunned down the governor. How could you condone one person taking the law into their own hands and justify it on religious grounds? Well, his response was, and the same response that I heard from many people in Pakistan during that time, that, oh, he's Qabl Qatl because he's endorsing this view because there were times during the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's lifetime that when people who insulted him who were killed. But we know that that was a misguided interpretation of what actually happened, what that evidence was. I wonder if you would like to comment on that as to how does one go back to these highly intelligent lawyers who are willing to defend this man to say the evidence you're using to defend him and the evidence you're using to negate the ability of someone to criticize the Prophet. In fact, if you just look at the example of the Prophet himself, as you cited, that if you follow his example, you wouldn't be committing such acts. What would you say to them, and how would you convince them as to their the baselessness of their position?
Thank you. Very briefly, I go back again to the context in which these lawyers actually function and the dominance of a particular discourse in Pakistan on this very issue. Pakistan is, generally speaking, I guess, like other Muslims elsewhere, they have particular obsessions. One of the obsessions is Ahmadi issue, again connected to apostasy, blasphemy, and more recently the critique of blasphemy laws, indirectly Islamization that went on in the 80s and 1990s and so forth. So for these lawyers who are functioning in this environment where the dominant discourse is very much 24 hours is saying to you that anyone who criticizes blasphemy law is criticizing Islam, is not respecting the honor of the Prophet, as if a Muslim kills somebody else, it is actually protecting the honor of the Prophet, is a rather problematic idea. But the dominant discourse within which they function, the dominance of religious establishment and their power to actually, I don't know of the 300 lawyers also who are trying to defend this particular guy, how many would be genuinely there, or maybe they want to show how Muslim they are to their audience, again, part of hypocrisy and so forth. People are really afraid because of the power of certain religious establishments in terms of the violence they could actually cause. We have seen a chief minister and also a minister being gunned down. So who are you as an ordinary person? You have to be careful. In blasphemy cases in Pakistan, how many lawyers are there to defend those people accused of blasphemy? Nobody wants to touch that. Because if you do, your house will be burned, your family could be targeted, you could be accused as a blasphemer, and you would be targeted, however wonderful you are as a Muslim. So it is the fear and the dominance of that discourse, and this idea that what you're getting from the tradition is the Islam. Forget about the Quran. Not many people read the Quran. People actually are listening to their mullahs and interpretations. Quran is there for, as we said, for barakah. Thank you.
Well, near the beginning of this year, we had the honor and privilege of hosting Sheikh Hamza Yusuf for a wonderful, deep, and illuminating discussion of issues in Islam. And now, near the end of the year, we have the equal honor and privilege of hosting Abdullah Saeed for an equally deep and serious discussion of issues in Islam. And for both of those, I wish to thank my friend Sohaib Sultan for the participation and co-sponsorship of the Muslim Life Program in the Office of Religious Life here at Princeton. Sohaib, we're so pleased to be able to cooperate with you, and we look forward to cooperating with your office in the future on many more discussions. I think these are very important and very illuminating, so thank you again. We will be closing the year with a conference on law, liberty, and virtue, which is scheduled for Monday and Tuesday, May 16th and 17th. That's a two-day conference on law, liberty, and virtue, which will be co-sponsored by the Association for the Study of Free Institutions and the Bhutan Law Lecture Fund, as well as the James Madison Program. The meetings for that conference will be here in Lewis Library 120, again, law, liberty, and virtue. And please join us after we thank Abdullah Saeed for a nice reception in his honor outside. And please now do join me in thanking Professor Saeed.